Welcome to the continuation of the 2016 Wilderness Issues Lecture Series. This year's theme, of course, is environmental economics, and the title is What's the Wild Word? This is our third week of 8 weeks. I would like to go ahead and introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Terry Anderson is the William A. Dunn Distinguished Senior Fellow at PERC, the Property and Environment Research Center, based in Bozeman, Montana. And he's the John and Jean Nault Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution with Stanford University. He is the author or editor of 38 books, including, most recently, Free Market Environmentalism for the Next Generation. It was put out in 2015 with Donald Leal. And recently also Environmental Markets, a Property Rights Approach in 2014. He has published widely in professional journals and the popular press, including frequent editorials in the Wall Street Journal. Dr. Anderson has been a visiting scholar at Oxford University, Basel University, Clemson University, and Cornell, as well as a Fulbright Fellow at the University of Canterbury. In March 2011, he received the Liberal-Only Institute's, which is in Prague, Czech Republic, annual award for his ideas promoting freedom and prosperity. Previous recipients of this award include Nobel laureates Milton Friedman, Gary Becker, and Vernon Smith. In 2015, Dr. Anderson received the Gary Walton Award for Excellence in Economic Education from the Foundation for Teaching Economics. Dr. Anderson received his Bachelor of Science degree right here at the University of Montana in 1968, and his MA and PhD degrees in economics from the University of Washington in 1972, after which he began his 25-year teaching career at Montana State University, where he won several teaching awards and is now Professor Emeritus. I always tell my colleagues, see, we work across lines between the University of Montana and Montana State. On top of all that, and relatable to all of us probably, Terry is also an avid outdoorsman who enjoys fly fishing, hiking, skiing, and I learned tonight can horseback ride to Yellowstone from his backyard. So with that, I would like to welcome Dr. Anderson to tonight's lecture.
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction, which I wrote. It used to say I had a BS degree, but I figured that was redundant for any professor. And then, given where it came from, no, sorry. A great pleasure to be back in Missoula. Always loved getting back here. I had a great teaching career at Montana State, but I could always go either way. So I also like to boast that I grew up here in Montana in a little town, Bridger, Montana. Anybody know where Bridger is? Whoa, oh, my cousin Mickey, who grew up in Bridger. You do too? All right. Jackson? No, okay. I said I was going to pick on Jackson tonight. And the reason that it's great coming from a town like that is I boast that I was the top 5% of my class. I was 1 out of 20. The smart girl moved away the year before I graduated, which allowed me to at least stay in the top 10% that way. But being from Montana makes a class like this and the topic like this all the more important. I remember once talking to somebody who listened to me and they said, "You really care about the environment, don't you?" I said, "Look, you wouldn't live here if you didn't. If you live in Montana, you have to care about the environment." So with that, I'm going to launch into this discussion of prices and pricelessness. And of course, I would be remiss in my charge if I didn't deal with some economic issues that are sort of important background for the rest of the lecture. So I want to start out first. Let me ask. I know we've got Jackson here, who's an expert in economics. How many of you have had an econ course somewhere in your life? It's okay. You don't have to be ashamed. All right. Well, that's quite a few. So for the rest of you, bear with this. It may be review for those of you who've had some econ, and for others, hopefully, you'll be able to pick up, because economics is not exactly that difficult, really. So I want to just talk a little bit about how important trade-offs are to economists. Economists love to talk about how we make decisions and how we maximize given the constraints we face. So this is a wonderful tool, if I can get this tool working, of explaining how we trade off labor and capital in this case against resource use here, and we could produce so much output along these lines. That is, if we used a lot of labor and capital and not so much resources we could produce, or we could go up here and use lots of resources. And Jackson, you've seen these isoquants. So, well, Jackson has it anyway. So let me just, you can take the stuff that's back in this. This is really just the stuff from the other graph that I had up there. And all these points that connect up are really important, because that tells us where we can maximize stuff. And Jackson, again, knows about maximization. So if you know if you know a lot of this maximization stuff, you can talk about our potential to convert resources along a resource conversion path. And you can, well, I mean, let me just move on, because again, I assume that's review for Jackson anyway. So let me take you to the really important one here for dealing with these issues. So if you took all the stuff back here and put it over here, and you took, this is just stuff, so if we took the stuff and converted it into how much satisfaction you get out of goods and services, how much utility, that's the term we economists like to use. So if we imagine that we had two people in the world, this is Jackson and this is Y. So Jackson, the economist, gets some utility out of this stuff, and somebody else gets utility, and we could give a lot of utility to Jackson and not much utility to somebody else. But there's only so much utility we can produce, and that's shown by this BB line here, which it's constrained. You only have so much resources, so much labor and capital, so much technology. So you can only produce so much, and then if we knew how to trade off Jackson's welfare or utility against somebody else's, we'd have this social welfare function. And if you knew that, if you took those two and put them together, you would then be able to take society to its bliss point, omega. Now, just Jackson's going to know how to do this after he gets his econ degree. And I went to graduate school thinking, wow, I am going to be able to take society to omega, the bliss point. And you start thinking about, man, that is really cool. I mean, you're a journalist, you write about stuff, but you don't know society's bliss point. And you study some ecology and some science, but this is really important, because it means that you are equipped with the tools to tell society how to make these trade-offs and how to get the maximum amount of satisfaction for the world, except that nobody really cares. And in fact, nobody has beaten the path to my door saying, can you tell us where omega is? And it's one of those things where for an economist, you kind of think, well, why not? And I think the answer is that we economists get kind of fixated on this, and so it explains why there are lots of economist jokes, and they are things like, if you laid all the economists in the world end to end, they wouldn't reach a conclusion. If you laid all the economists in the world end to end, they wouldn't point in a single direction. And the one you're going to really love, especially as the night wears on, if you laid all the economists in the world end to end, it would be a good thing. Lots of economists think they can do that, and that's why it would be a good thing if they got laid end to end. But then I was recently introduced, and I was given my economist hat, and I was asked the question, you know what an economist is, don't you? And of course I was obliged to say no, because I didn't know for sure. And the answer was, it's someone who's pretty good with numbers, but doesn't have enough personality to be an accountant. So I think you can kind of see why we have this reputation. We draw these graphs, we dazzle the Jacksons that come to our classes, and we think, this is a powerful set of tools. And I want to make the case that it is a pretty powerful set of tools, but there are some reasons why it doesn't enter many of the policy debates, and in particular doesn't enter the wilderness conservation debate as much as it should. But first, one last set of graphs, and I want to put this, I'll call this wildernomics. So we're talking about wilderness, and so the question to the economist is, how much wilderness should we have? how much wilderness is enough? And I remember being at a conference in Jackson Hole many, many years ago. A former dean of the forestry school had discovered economics, and he basically was touting this graph. And this graph says, well, if you're wondering how much wilderness we should have, all we need to know is what are the marginal benefits, what are the extra benefits we get from one more acre of wilderness, and what's the extra value of that wilderness. And then we trade that off against costs, and we say, well, you know, if we don't have many acres of wilderness, we're just creating the Bob Marshall, it's really pretty valuable. But if you want to make another wilderness, let's say you want to connect the north and south ends of the Lee Metcalf wilderness down in the Gallatin and the Madison Range, maybe it's not quite as important as the Bob Marshall. And then the other way is, if you're just putting a little bit of land into wilderness, you know, nobody's going to care much, you know, one little wilderness there, one little wilderness here. But if you start trying to make too much, then the costs start to rise. That is, you're giving up something. You're saying, you know, that could be used for something else, housing, oil development. And so when I used to teach the big sections of Econ 101, I would tell the students, the answer is always the same in economics. If the extra benefits you get, the marginal benefits of another unit of wilderness exceed the marginal cost, the extra costs of it, do it. So this is a good unit to add because the benefits are greater than the cost. This one is, this one is, this one is. And we get out here to omega, the bliss point. Now if you start adding them, the costs exceed the benefits. And so there's how we would think about the optimal amount of wilderness. And as I mentioned, I was at this conference in Jackson, and this dean somebody had told this forestry dean, this is really powerful, and he was talking about, you know, we can really use this tool to understand how much wilderness we should have. And I listened, and I'm thinking, all right, you know, we got a forestry dean using economics. This is really cool. And yet, you know, not many people really care about this. Not many people look at these graphs and say, voila, there is a really powerful tool. And to get you to understand why, I'm going to take off my economist hat here, and I want you to just kind of imagine the question of who cares. And here I'll just switch hats for a moment and ask you to think about wilderness if this is the hat you wear. Now, you know, you're out there, you've got a trail bike, and you've been rodding through this area. This could be the crest trail along the Gallatin Range, separating the Gallatin from the Yellowstone. It's an area that's been open to roaded vehicles. These guys are up there all the time. By the way, I had to borrow this helmet. It's a little tight, so I won't keep it on too long. So what do these people think? Well, I went to their website. We need to take back Montana. We are, if I go back to my other graph out there, we are way over here. We're past Omega. So we've got to take back Montana. We've got to get the number of acres. So we certainly don't want to increase them. It's going to be pretty hard to ratchet them back. But we have to take it back. Or imagine if I put on my forestry hat here and think about how foresters look at this. If you're a logger and you're thinking, I am in the business of helping people get houses, poor people. I can get 2x4s and 2x6s, and I can supply the world with lumber. And I can promote healthy forests and healthy communities. And through management, this is the Montana Wood Products Association website. And so a lot of the people who wear this hat are saying, more wilderness? I can ratchet you back, not you young people, the older people here, I can ratchet back to the spotted owl issue. We've got to save this land so we'll have spotted owls in the Pacific Northwest, and so we'll shut down logging. Well, the people wearing this hat were saying, just a doggone minute here. I don't want to shut down logging. It's my job. And in fact, I'm doing God's work here. I'm providing shelter for people. What could be more important than food and shelter? And so you start thinking, where do these people think that set of curves intersects? Certainly not that way. These are people who have costs and benefit perceptions very different than other people's. And it's their perception, not what I might calculate their benefits to be, but what they think it is that enters into this debate. And they say, omega, it's back here, somewhere near the origin. Well, I don't want to leave everybody out because some people think, you know, I'm here to really help out. So I'll put on my Smokey the Bear hat and get you to think about it from the perspective of people managing the national forest. Again, these are not bad people. They're not trying to put the people in that yellow hard hat out of business. They're not trying to take a trail away from somebody who wants to ride a trail bike. They're trying to do what's right. They're caring for the land and serving the people. And they're thinking, you know, we have to do this multiple use management. We have to provide some trees, we have to provide some clean water, some wildlife habitat, and we have to provide some wildlands. And so people who wear this hat, you know, they're good guys. They're trying to find omega, but they have a slightly different perspective as to how much ought to be in wilderness. And mind you, I have a lot of sympathy for them because they're trying to figure out this balance in a world where there's lots of tugging and pulling and people suggesting that we don't have the omega level. And now I'll put on the hat that I really wear the most, my environmentalist hat, and get you to think about this from the perspective of a real environmentalist. That's not me, not even when I was younger. But I do wear this. I remember once when my son was, he was probably 10 or so, and we were going out into the sun. I looked down and I said, "What do you have for your head?" And he looked up and said, "Hair." And I changed the will after that. So I wear this, yes, you can do this, you can cover up the part that you don't have hair. But so how do most environmentalists look at it and think, too much wilderness? Omega levels of wilderness? Come on. How could you possibly have too much wilderness? Look at all the area we have plowed over with fields, and look at all the area we've paved over with parking lots. Well, a little more wilderness is a good thing, not a bad thing. And so, again, there's lots of debate over just what is the optimal amount, and it all centers around our inability to articulate the value of this, other than to say, I'm right and you're wrong. So I want to just have you continue to focus on this wilderness debate, understanding a really important point, that what this has done has tied the Forest Service in particular into what my friend Jack Ward Thomas, who was chief of the Forest Service in the Clinton administration, and Jack said his job was really tough because the Forest Service was tied in a Gordian knot. He couldn't untangle it. It was just this knot that constricted what he could do. And he said, I had people who knew how to manage trees. I had people who knew how to manage water and wildlife. And yet I couldn't use the management tools that we had because we were just wrapped up in this hat debate up here. And I found this postcard recently. I love it. You know, so he was in the U.S. Department of Aggravation. You know, no pets, no hunting, no parking, no camping. There should be one that just says no fun. And when you think about it, it's because these lands, and this is, I think, a key point to understanding this whole debate, these are not public lands. They are public, that's the word we use. But I find it much more useful to understand the debate by considering what they really are, political lands. Now again, probably no one else in this room, well, a couple of people might recognize this former senator from Montana. This is John Melcher. He was a senator from Montana, and he lost his seat to Conrad Burns because he thought Omega was that way. And John really believed we needed more wilderness. He pushed for expanding the Lee Metcalf wilderness. He pushed for having more wilderness areas. And Conrad, he was more of a cowboy, but he kind of sympathized with the people who wore the hard hats. And that political debate, really over wilderness, cost Senator Melcher his position. He learned that, wow, this really is about how politics is going to sort out what is basically a zero-sum game. Who has the rights? Does that trail bike rider have a right to ride those trails in the Gallatin? Or do I, and I much prefer being out there in the solitude, do I have a right to the solitude, to keep those trail bikes out, mechanized vehicles out? And the solution to this, the answer to this, is almost always a zero-sum game. By that I just mean, if I win, she loses. If she wins, I lose. And when it's that zero-sum kind of game, the result is it's hard to know how the results are going to play out. It's hard to know how the politics are going to change. In the next election, will it be John Melcher beating out Conrad Burns because that politics has changed? And how much will we spend in our time, our effort, our money? Just look at what we spend on campaigns today. How much will we spend sorting this out? When I finally realized that nobody cares about Omega, that we don't care about it because we have these very different sets of values, I began to really think more about, is there another way? Is there an alternative way of kind of getting these debates resolved that doesn't have to be so filled with conflict and doesn't have to be zero-sum? And this led me to write a book with my colleague Don Leal in 1991 with the title Free Market Environmentalism. Now, if you wear a red bandana and you hear that term all in one mouthful, you've got to be thinking, wait, free markets, what do? Well, they rape and pillage. They're the ones that destroy the environment. How could you possibly take free markets and the environment and put them together? Just to show you how hard it was for people to swallow that term, a reviewer of this book wrote a nice review in a, well, not so nice review in a professional journal, and he said, free market environmentalism is an oxymoron, and Leal and Anderson are the moron part. You know, that really kind of sets you back on your heels and say, yeah, I thought I was really pretty smart writing this book. He says, no, you're just morons to think you can take these and put them together. And in fact, in 1991, when we wrote this book, and I'll tell you a bit more about what was in it, but when we wrote this, we thought, you know, boy, this is a great way to think about the world. But we didn't have many examples. There weren't many cases where we could point and say, here's a market system helping resolve an environmental problem. And so it was kind of a theoretical book. Fortunately, it didn't have any of those kind of graphs in it. But it was kind of, if we could get the system set up right, maybe we could have some bargaining going on and people producing conservation and environment the same way you might produce a plastic hat. What are people willing to pay? How much does it cost? Let's come together. We'll strike a deal. Go down to the hardware store. You can buy a plastic hat. There's a price on it, and everybody wins. So we thought, you know, we had this great idea, and then 10 years went by, and we revised the book. And we decided to revise the book because in the 10 years from 1991 to 2001, we had started to see many people in the environmental community saying, is it really worth the battles that go on in the political process to get what we want? Or can we do it another way? Can we bargain and find a result that could work? And by this time, water markets were starting to evolve. And so people were saying, you know, there's 80 to 90% of the water in the West goes to agriculture. We should have a little more for, first off, for communities, for urban uses. How could we make that happen? Well, let's have the city of Missoula buy some water from farmers and keep it in the tanks for the people who live in the urban areas. So Bozeman has a lot of water rights that are stored up in Highlight Canyon and in Mystic Lake, and those water rights used to flow down the streams and go to fields. Now a lot of them go to the taps of people who live in town. So water markets were starting to work. But some people were starting to say, are there ways we can negotiate differently to achieve some end results that we want? And one of my favorite examples that I won't spend a lot of time on, but it really is my favorite of favorites, is the whole wolf reintroduction issue. The wolves, the whole idea was, should we reintroduce wolves into Yellowstone? The debate went on till 1995 when we flew down 19 legal immigrants from, I think they were legal immigrants from Canada, and we put them in a pen in Yellowstone, and we threw some elk carrion in with them so they could get used to eating the elk, and then we let them loose, and they did pretty well. And there was lots of debate about, well, what about the killing of livestock by these wolves? And the ranchers said, you know, this is going to cost us something. And the environmentalists were saying, well, it's your problem. You know, you put your cattle out there in harm's way. Tough if they get eaten by a wolf. And Hank Fisher from Missoula, a good friend, had a very innovative kind of market approach. He said, I'm going to raise some private money. I'm going to put it into a trust fund in an account here in Missoula, and I'm going to pay ranchers if they have any wolf predation, livestock owners if they have wolf predation. Now, a lot of the environmental community said, what? These are the evil people. We can't be paying them. They shouldn't have their cows out there anyway. And the ranchers were saying, well, you should pinko commie environmentalists, you shouldn't have wolves out there. We had the omega number before, we had none. We got it down to the optimal number from many ranchers' perspective. So here was a guy, Hank Fisher, who really truly was thinking like a business entrepreneur. How can I make this work a little bit better? Well, finally, in last year, 2015, Don and I published the 3rd edition, and for me and Don both, the last edition, and we tagged a tagline on it for the next generation for 2 reasons. One, we got a lot smarter as we got older, and we got a bunch of young people to write chapters for us. But we put our names on the covers. So we got, that's the next generation of writers. But more importantly to me, this book is filled with examples of one after another of what I call enviropreneurs, environmental entrepreneurs, who are finding ways that work. That phrase comes from one of the biggest of the environmental groups, the Environmental Defense Fund. Their slogan, the president of the Environmental Defense Fund, Fred Krupp, is a good friend of mine, and Fred said, he's a lawyer, he said, when I went to work for Environmental Defense Fund, our slogan was sue the bastards. And that's how they operated. He knew what he was there for. You know, sue this person for violating the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act. Sue this person for violating the Endangered Species Act. And now, and he's very upfront about this, they don't have that attitude anymore. The slogan, go to their website, it says, finding the ways that work. And so the Environmental Defense Fund now is looking for these kind of oxymoronic, if you will, free market environmental solutions. What is free market environmentalism? I know graphs. It's really pretty easy. One, it begins by understanding that the economy and the environment are very dynamic. And to put omegas out there and try to find out the optimal level of about anything is impossible in a changing world. And so because the environment is dynamic, because the economy is dynamic, we have to think differently about how we deal with it. My good friend and ecologist, Dan Botkin, who would win a Nobel Prize in ecology if they gave one, he said the environment is not a Kodachrome, oh no, that's if you take your phone out and take a little picture. That's called a Kodachrome moment, if you don't remember. So he said, it's not this just little click image of what it's like right now. It's a moving picture. It's always changing. Think about it in the context of climate. So let's just stipulate that the Earth is warming, that climate is changing, and suppose that you are working for the Nature Conservancy. And you have this piece of land that you'd like to get a conservation easement for. Conservation easement means you can restrict how that land is used. And you say, this piece of land is perfect for a species we care about. And we're going to get the owner of this land to put a constraint on the use of that land, give us an easement that says, thou shalt not build houses, plow the field, whatever it might be to keep that endangered species. But remember, this environment is dynamic. This is a perpetual easement. That's a long time. It's going to be there forever. And now climate changes. And that habitat that you thought was perfect for that species is no longer perfect. But you just got an easement that you can't change. The Nature Conservancy is very, very concerned about holding easements on land that restrict its use that aren't going to be productive for them. They'd like to figure out a way to make these easements much more dynamic. And they have entrepreneurs in the Nature Conservancy who are coming up with innovative ways of dealing with, of making those changes. If you start thinking about the way we deal with our public lands, our political lands, our wilderness lands, it really is this kind of Kodachrome still life. Up behind the house where Monica and I live are some trees, and they're really pretty. They're green. And in the winter, it's got a little snow on it. And it really looks nice. And you can imagine taking the picture and saying, wow, that's really cool. But is it going to stay that way? Let me give you the perfect example of this. This is a debate going on today in Yosemite National Park. The picture on the far left, 1868, is a picture of what it looked like when you looked up at El Capitan. And it's a good place to get a picture of El Capitan. Time goes on, and all of a sudden, those damn trees grow up. And those trees mean you can't get pictures of El Capitan anymore. And finally, a fire comes along and burns a bunch of those trees. Oh, I might add that if we went farther out that way and we had the Kodachrome or cell phone to take some pictures, we would have found it was even more void of trees. And the reason is the Native Americans who lived there were trying to grow crops and attract wildlife. And the wildlife wouldn't come to dense forests, and they couldn't grow crops, so they were burning Yosemite Valley. Well, now this is what it looks like. 2009. Well, it's the same place. You can't even see El Capitan. And so the Park Service said, we should cut some trees and destroy that Kodachrome still life. And so the Park Service is wrapped in the same kind of Gordian knot that Jack Ward Thomas was wrapped in, and they haven't been able to deal with the fact that the Yosemite Valley is filling with trees, and it's been dynamic the whole time. Starting back with human beings over here burning trees, human beings coming along, human beings causing fires. They weren't burning it to create fields for agriculture. And now human beings saying, this is dynamic. We would like to see El Cap. How can you create a system that allows for adjustments to that? So that's tenet one. It's dynamic. And the second important part of free market environmentalism is to recognize two words: incentives matter. And ask yourself, what are the incentives for people to make adjustments in this dynamic world, to adjust to the changing in nature, the changing demands that we humans put on it? And one way to understand it in the context of incentives is to think of a rental car. And I used to say, no one washes a rental car. And that's kind of true. I go down to Stanford University for a couple of months, rent a car, and I don't wash that car. On the other hand, I wash my car at home. What's the difference? And somebody caught me up when I said no one washes a rental car, and they said, except Hertz. Why does Hertz wash the rental car?
They own the car.
They own the car, exactly. And if they own the car, they capture the value of that car that's left when they take it out of the fleet. They change the oil, they wash it, they vacuum it, they take good care of it. As the renter of that car, I don't have the same incentives. Now, there's some fine print that says, if I take a hammer out and just bang in a fender or run it into something, I'm going to be liable for that. But they would have a hard time getting me to care as much as they do because they own it. So how can we get the incentives aligned so that people will do the kinds of things that we would like them to do, depending on our hat, to be sure, and that's really what those books in free market environmentalism are all about. How can we change the incentives? Let me give you a couple of examples of the incentives being right to make the balancing I've been talking about occur without the kind of conflict that we see with our wilderness. North Maine woods, several million acres of land that involve some state, some private, no federal. They have multiple uses. They balance timber, ecosystem services, hunting, canoeing, snowmobiling, trail biking, mountain biking. They balance it all. And they balance it by saying, we as an organization, North Maine Woods, Inc., want to make a profit. And we care about making that profit by finding out what the demands are, what people are willing to pay. And we care about it in the long term because this is a company that wants to be around. And so they make decisions that make these trade-offs and have created a pretty nice ecosystem balancing the various hats that are up here. Or closer to home, the Flathead Indian Reservation is just a wonderful example of management where the incentives are much different than they are on public lands. So Allison Berry, a young lady who worked at PERC for a while, did a study comparing the Flathead Reservation with the Lolo National Forest. And she asked the question of how are these two side-by-side forests managed? And something that we economists like to harp on is that virtually all federal lands are run at a loss. This is a corporation that continually loses money, the U.S. Forest Service. And what Allison found, looking at the bottom line there, that the U.S. Forest Service, for the period she was looking at, 2006, had costs of running its timber operations of $24 million, revenues of $26. It actually made a little bit of money, harvested a lot of trees. And if you look at it on a board foot basis, it was doing pretty well. Not many forests in Montana do that well. And then she looked at how the Salish Kootenai Confederated Tribes were doing. Which of those two companies would you like to have investments in? Your national forest, which you have some investments in, whether you like it or not, or the Salish Kootenai Confederated Tribes. They make $2 for every dollar they spend. $2 for every dollar they spend. That's not bad. And they do it because the tribe gets the money. That forest is the Hertz for the Salish Kootenai Confederated Tribes. Maybe more importantly for our discussion here is, yeah, most of the money comes out of trees. But these are Allison's conclusions. If you look at what the tribe does, it cares about a lot more than just the health of trees and the board feet of trees. It cares about the sustainable harvest. It cares about the age distribution of trees, the species distribution. It cares about water quality, fish and wildlife habitat, and the list goes on. But she found that you didn't have the same kind of responses in the national forest. So the question is, how can we change the incentives for our national forests? And we need to change it. This is a report card that was done in the last month or so out of Region 1 here in Missoula. One of the Forest Service people said in the article here in the Missoulian, this is a D- report card. We don't look very good. And then he went through, the study goes through and says, here are some problems we face. And this is just focusing largely on the recreational component. We have deferred maintenance. We've got all this stuff we know we have to do, and we have no money to do it. Millions of dollars. Mind you, if you look at the Park Service, it's way worse than the Forest Service in Region 1. We have all these recreation sites out there, and they're damaged. They don't, they have garbage strewn around. They aren't very well taken care of. And trail maintenance. Our budget is taking a big cut. How can we do what we're supposed to do in this kind of environment? And so Region 1 is saying, we got a problem, folks. This train is not running very well. And it forces me to then say, well, what can we do about it? And part of what we need to recognize is that those of us who wear this hat and put on our hiking boots and walk out there are getting a free lunch, a subsidy, if you will. We complain about subsidies to timber companies. We complain about subsidies to grazers, but look in the mirror. These are the numbers for the revenues taken in by the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management for the period 2009 to 2013, a study we did at PERC last year. We spend huge amounts of money. This is the expenses of the Forest Service per recreation visit. $2.81 of expenses, and the revenues are 78 cents. That's a hard business to run and make it be very sustainable. Again, we aren't paying our way. So the bottom line of changing the incentives, I think, and the argument I want to make and ultimately wrap up with, that's, be a good thing when I sit down, is it's time to pay to play. And let's look at it. Hunters, fishers pay to play. They buy licenses. They pay the license fee, and it goes to the agency they pay it to, the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. Those license fees go to managing wildlife. Now, depending on whether you get your deer or your elk, you can complain about how well they manage it, but they manage it, and the money stays there. And in addition to that, to the hunting licenses, we hunters and fishers pay what are called Pittman-Robinson excise taxes. I wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal a year ago, and I never get to choose the title for the pieces I write. They do. This is one I wished I could take claim for. It was, "Why Ducks Quack for Obama?" And the answer was, because of the big spike in gun sales in the last few years, the Pittman-Robinson fees have just skyrocketed, and those all go to state agencies and federal agencies that use them for such things as wildlife management areas, such things as our wildlife refuges. So the ducks are saying, hey, hallelujah. Yeah, there might be a few shotguns out there shooting at us more than there were before, but if they're in my hands, the ducks are safe anyway. But we pay, and as a result, we have agencies. Using my hunter's hat, which I don't have with me, we have agencies that respond to the fact that they know who their customers are. And not only do hunters and fishers do it, states do it. If you go down and buy your hunting license in Montana today, you will be asked, do you want a state permit to access state school trust lands? If you don't have it and you go on those trust lands chasing your elk or your deer, you are trespassing and you can be arrested and fined for that. And so if you look at what states do, again, these are some data from this study I mentioned earlier, that revenue per dollar spent for the Forest Service, 28 cents. Revenue per dollar spent BLM, 20 cents. Revenue per dollar spent in Montana, $6.31 in revenue from recreation. Good heaven, net revenue, right? That's per dollar spent. That's not bad. Idaho, and then if you look at it over state trust lands generally. States are charging fees for recreation, people are paying it, and people are getting a service for it. We are getting something as demanders from the suppliers. And finally, national parks do it. A few years ago, we did some work at PERC just trying to advocate it's time to increase park fees. I use these numbers because if you look at what it cost to enter Yellowstone in real dollars when they opened the gates to automobiles in 1915, holy cow, that was a lot of money, right? Today, we raised it to $30. They just raised the entrance fees to the national parks from $25 to $30. Superintendent of Yellowstone was elated when I and some of my colleagues said, hey, we'll write editorials to newspapers. We'll support you in raising these fees. And he was elated because he understood this meant $3 million extra dollars into the park that they could use to fix some of that backlog. Now they have millions of dollars worth of maintenance issues, so this is not a drop in the bucket. But it means they have more money to manage the lake trout introduction into Yellowstone Lake, the invasive species they want to get rid of. They have some money to deal with that. Glacier, $5 million. So how might this apply to our wilderness and our conservation values if we wear that red bandana? A couple of quick closing examples. So I call this, we need that kind of Hank Fisher environmental entrepreneurship, enviropreneurship. What if we just paid more fees? Outside of Bozeman, up Highlight Canyon, the road is plowed. When I used to go up there a lot of years ago in a beat-up old 1953 Willys Jeep to go ice climbing, we were lucky to get up there, and then we had to ski a long ways to get to the ice. Today, you can pretty well drive any four-wheel drive, and even a front-wheel drive, up there most any day of the winter. Why? Because the road is plowed. Why is the road plowed? Because there are fees paid by people who are saying, we want to get up there. This is a really beautiful area for winter recreation, skiing, ice climbing, ice fishing, and the list goes on. Well, it doesn't pay the full bill, but there are voluntary organizations saying to the Forest Service that manages that road, can you plow the road if we help pay for it? It changes the way those Smokey the Bear hat wearing guys think about this problem. Or this is the Rendezvous Ski Trail down in West Yellowstone. It's maintained. It's a 2-track trail that you can go ski on. And it's, maybe you're into backcountry skiing. It's not for that. If you want to do a 2-track ski along, it's a great place to go. And it's maintained by the Forest Service. But you pay a fee if you're going to go there. And there are many other examples like this. My point is just, suppose we started paying for some of that trail backlog. Suppose we started saying, I will put a little tag on my backpack that says, I've paid my trail fee for the year. Maybe just for the Bob Marshall, maybe for all of Region 1. Maybe it's nationwide, but I have paid some share of that cost. How would that start to change the incentives of the managers, of the people who really do care about those forests if they had that? Well, I'm pretty libertarian, and I could go on with why we ought to privatize the national forests. I won't try to convince you of that, but let me throw out an idea that one of my other colleagues, Holly Fretwell, put forward recently. She said, suppose we think about franchising some of our management. So suppose we said, we're going to franchise the Bob Marshall. Pretty iconic piece of wilderness area. We'll franchise it. We'll make sure it's this. She put it in the context of national parks as well. But we're going to franchise it, and we're going to say still belongs to the federal government. Still has constraints on what can be done. You can't go in there and build a 4-lane highway. You can't bring in mechanized vehicles. But you are like the owner of a McDonald's or a Burger King. You have a franchise. Think of innovative ways to run this thing to produce hamburgers and make a profit. And I guarantee you McDonald's doesn't say, you know, if you want to get out of the hamburger business and go into being a pizza parlor, you'll lose your franchise. They don't want you doing that. They put constraints on. Well, okay, we're going to say it's still a wilderness, but you can get more innovative in the way that you manage that. How would it change the incentives and get people thinking about that backlog of maintenance, the dispersed sites that are run down and not taken care of? Yellowstone used to have a problem of dumping raw sewage into Yellowstone Lake. I mean, if any private developer did that, we'd hang them from the highest tree. But they don't have the right money to do it, or the right incentives to get it fixed. Would a franchise help? Or another friend of mine at the University of Maryland has said, well, what if we tried using something like charter schools? They're kind of still like a public school. That is, they still have public funding. But suppose we had charter forests. And we said, this forest really should be designated for cross-country skiing in the winter, some timber production, and mountain bike trails. Okay, and I'm sorry for all the people out there who would really like to drive motorbikes. We're not going to do that in this charter forest. Well, what if we just experimented a little bit? I have even made the case, given what the Salish Kootenai Confederated Tribes have demonstrated, why don't we just give some of our forests to some Indian tribes like the Salish Kootenai or the Crow or the Blackfeet and see how they did it? It would change the incentives, and we might learn a lot from how we could provide these important environmental goods more effectively. Pay to play. Well, as I said, if you laid all the economists in the world, it would be a good thing. I will soon be one of those economists, and I'll sit down. But let me conclude by just wrapping up and getting you to think about these issues in the following way. There's this value chain. Business people like to talk about value chains. This value chain, on one hand, is the demander who's willing to buy the product. On the other hand are a bunch of suppliers. And the question is, how can you connect the demanders and suppliers? How can you strengthen this value chain so that the people who are willing to wave their dollars and bid in the marketplace convince the people who are willing to take their valuable time, effort, money, resources, and produce things? How can you bring them together? And prices are a way of doing that. If you talk to Superintendent Wenck down in Yellowstone, he will tell you, once we started collecting fees at the Yellowstone gate and keeping some of them in Yellowstone as opposed to sending them to the black hole in Washington, D.C., it changed the behavior of Park Service people. They started seeing themselves as part of a value chain. You were showing up at the gate, and when you showed up at the gate and were willing to pay your $25, now $30, you were seen as a valued customer. And the result was it has changed the way the Park Service has managed many of the parks. So I want to suggest that for those of us who wear this red bandana, we ought to think about the fact that we basically are getting a free lunch. We claim that the things that we value, the wilderness areas, the ecosystem services, are priceless, and we refuse to put a price on them. But if, in fact, as environmentalists, we started putting our money, as I said here, where our boots are, maybe it would change the incentives. It would certainly signal that this priceless wilderness that I care a lot about, I hike in, hunt in, ride horses in, that priceless wilderness does have value. And we could reflect our value in what we're willing to pay. And if we did that, it would connect us with the suppliers in a way that we're not connected now. It would take us away from that zero-sum battle with the set of hats over there and put us in a situation where maybe we could find more cooperative solutions. I end with this quote from a friend who's a rancher over near Big Timber, Montana. And he said to me once, I was talking about wildlife and wildlife habitat, how do we encourage the landowner to produce wildlife habitat. He's a crusty old rancher, has a beard, kind of long hair, and he looked at me and he just said, if it pays, it stays. That's a way of thinking about what it is we would like to have. We want wilderness to stay. If we help make it pay a little bit, maybe it wouldn't get caught up in a political battle where we'd be less likely to have what we want. So as you walk away and think about the theme of this seminar, this set of classes and lectures, think about that value chain. Think about how it is we connect what we want with the people who supply it. In the marketplace, it's quite clear. In the political arena and in political lands, it's not so clear, but we can clarify it. We can clarify it a lot if we just start thinking about what it's worth to us and how we pay. Well, I will tell you one more useful tidbit that I learned in a high school speech class, and it was when you're speaking to an audience like this, stand up to be seen. You've seen me. Speak up to be heard. I'm mic'd, can't miss it, but sit down to be appreciated. Thank you very much. But Natalie won't let you or me off the hook, so you're stuck here for another 28 minutes. I do have the PERC website. You'll find some other data and some of the studies I referred to at www.perc.org. And if you want to rant and rave at me, use my email address. I have a delete button. I don't care. No, I really do appreciate feedback, and I will do my best to be serious in responding if I can help later on. But for now, let's play Stump the Speaker. Jackson. Oh, geez, he's the econ major. Where's the other econ majors? I know there are a couple more in here. Questions? It can be about these issues or any other where I might have some free market environmental solution. Go ahead.
It's a pretty open-ended question, but how would we go about finding value for people like me who prefer preservation, just leaving humans out entirely? How do you go about paying for that?
Well, if we truly, and I'm going to take you at your word that you mean leaving humans out in total. So we're not talking about the Bob Marshall Wilderness, which is hardly leaving humans out. There are lots of them who go in there every day. We're not talking about Yellowstone Park, which has millions of visitors. We're talking about setting aside a piece of land and saying, you can't come in. That's what you're suggesting. Well, the way that groups, well, this isn't a perfect example of this, but the Nature Conservancy has some pieces of land that they don't let people into, by and large. I mean, they may let a scientist in now and then. And they do it by either taking ownership of the land or getting an easement that says you can't go there. Now, if there's going to be cattle ranching in addition to saving it for posterity or whatever, people will get there. But they do have parcels that they just say, no, you can't say, hey, I paid my $25 to the Nature Conservancy, I want to walk in there. No, you can't do that. Now, most of them are not that way all the time, every day, 365, forever and ever. But you could do it that way. Join up the group, tell me what it is that you want to save, convince me that you're right, this piece of land ought to never have any footprints of human beings from this day forward, and convince me of it. Buy that land and do it. If you think you're going to do that in a process where you've got all these hats, it's going to be far more impossible than trying to imagine how you'd get you and your fellow travelers together to make that happen in a place where you could buy the land and shut it off. It will be a hard sell because I'm guessing that not too many people would say, oh, wonderful, wait a minute, I can't go there? Why can't we just keep the rest of the riffraff out and let me go there? And so it's a hard sell, but that tells us something about people's values too, that people don't value it enough. Now, you might then quickly change the debate from it's not a value case, it's I know omega, I know the optimal number of people, I know that this is a piece of land that ought not to have anybody in it, and so you get some of your environmental studies, science people over on this side of the room to do the studies to show why one boot track will destroy this. Maybe you can win that, but that's a hard one to win in either a private kind of setting or a political setting. More, okay.
With a fee to public lands, would there be a worry for public land to be considered more exclusive and maybe affect the value of public land to people?
But help me a bit when you say more exclusive.
If you were to put a fee to enter a public land, would that exclude people from entering it and thus make it less valuable because there would be less demand for it?
Well, yeah, great question. So the question was, suppose we put a fee on it, and now people say, well, that's too much money. I'm not going there. And then people say, well, there aren't so many people going there. It must not have been that valuable. Okay, this is an argument that runs through hunting circles all the time. That if we make people pay higher hunting fees, whenever I go buy my hunting license and walk into the regional office in Bozeman, and they charge me a whopping, I think it's $76 for shooting about anything I want to shoot other than bald eagles. I always tell the woman behind the counter, I wish you charged more. And she looks at me like, what? Are you crazy? Charge more? I say, look, what a great deal I get. I get all these opportunities to hunt and fish. It costs me $76 just because I'm old? I mean, come on. I'm pretty wealthy compared to most of you students. You ought to be charging me more, not less. But one of the arguments is if you started doing that, then you students wouldn't buy hunting licenses. And if you students didn't buy hunting licenses, we'd have fewer hunters. If we have fewer hunters, then there would be less demand for a Fish and Wildlife Agency, and the list goes on. And so, yeah, there is a problem. But on the other hand, suppose that you raise the fee. So here we go. I told Natalie I wouldn't give you too much econ jargon, but this one's a useful piece. There's a concept we use in economics called elasticity. Okay, elasticity was right on the tip of Jackson's tongue. He wakes up every day just thinking about elasticity. Elasticity of demand is just a very simple concept. It says if you raise the price, people will probably do less of it. Okay, that's a fundamental law in economics. The question is, if you raise the price 10%, will we have a 10% reduction, a 100% reduction, or a 1% reduction in how much demand there is? Well, if you raise the price 10% and you only get a little reduction in the amount of people who want to buy it, what does that do to your revenues? It says, I got lots more money. So suppose we raise the fee to Yellowstone. Do you think that's going to cause a lot of, we went from $25 to $30. Okay, do the math. That's a 1/5 more. That's 20% more than it was before. Do you think it's going to cause people to say, whoa, I'm not going to Yellowstone anymore. It's not worth seeing Old Faithful for an extra $5 for 7 days? Probably not. That's why Yellowstone's going to collect a lot more money. And how about that busload of people who just arrived from some European country? And they flew in on a jet and maybe even came business class. And they pull up to the gate and we say, you don't have an American passport and you don't pay taxes. You have to pay $100 for 7 days. Are they going to say, boy, we're going back to Europe? Or are they going to say, we're not coming? I think not. So we could raise that price, get a lot more revenue, and deal with a lot of the management issues that are related to the fact we don't have the resources, to say nothing of perhaps reducing some of the political debate. I'll ask the next question, which is, I'll get you in a second, because the follow-up question ought to be, what about the poor people? Like, okay, Anderson, you say hunting licenses should be $150, but you're just some rich old emeritus professor. That's what emeritus means, old. You've got lots more money than the rest of us, and so poor people can't afford to hunt. Well, when I am king, here's what I do. I just say, how much money do you make? And I'd set some level and say, if you're below this, you get hunting licenses for free. And we sock it to the rich people. Why not do that? We do it with food stamps. We say, we think there are some people out there who can't afford to get enough food. And so we think we should tax the general population to allow them to get more food. I don't see any reason we couldn't do that with park stamps, with hunting stamps, or with wilderness stamps. So, again, there are people out there who can, and I would argue, should be paying more. And if they did, it would really help deal with the fiscal problems we face. Question back there.
How about those annual passes that they need $8 for in my pocket? It's the best deal.
Oh, but soon it'll get better. Because I've got the old man's pass here.
That pass is $20.
I mean, but if I can, just so these annual passes, my wife Monica's younger than I am, and she reveled in the day she could buy a Golden Eagle pass for me. And now I go up and they don't even ask for my ID to see if I have a Golden Eagle pass. So, but why should we be giving wealthy people, and that's by and large old people. Now, okay, there are some people on Social Security who are barely making it, but if you look at wealth distribution, it's skewed towards people who are older. We give them the breaks. Well, I don't think we should. Go ahead.
I assume that you could agree that F.A. Hayek was a brilliant man, never to grace this planet.
Pretty much, yeah. I had dinner with him twice.
But he even stated, well, it's impractical to make the enjoyment of certain services dependent on the payment of a price. That competition alone will not produce the desired level of services. The road served them, 20 plus years before the enactment of the Wilderness Act. And I think then you kind of break off the Wilderness Act, which to me is basically saying top line, prices can connect demand to supplies. As a matter of public policy, we're going to say that we just deem it a social value, a social good as a maritime. Then you know what? We're going to remove that from wilderness areas. And I know, and I'm with you on so many issues when it comes to national parks, things like that I frequent. But on wilderness areas, I think it's a different equation, or at least you have to go back and say, the Wilderness Act, as intended to be enacted, was one of those things that Hayek was talking about. And we all can think about there's just going to be some externality, there's going to be some social goods. I mean, we're going to basically say that, like my son was 8th grader back at Washington, D.C., walking the mall, we're going to start charging him a fee. We're going to say that we should privatize the Arizona Memorial and Pearl Harbor. I mean, I think there's something that's a matter of public social policy in our nation. But we say, you know what, let's take out the price equation. And even that we're just going to say it's just good.
Okay. So let me first begin by defending F.A. Hayek, a brilliant man, won the Nobel Prize, and say that Hayek would never have gotten caught in the, if he had listened to the first few minutes of my lecture, he would have walked out, because if he took me seriously, he would have thought, oh my God, this person really thinks we can find omega? He didn't pretend for 1 second that markets were some panacea that always found the bliss point. And so he understood that there were lots of reasons why markets might not capture all the benefits and all the costs. That said, how would he feel about something like the Wilderness Act? And you know, I don't pretend to have known Hayek that well, but I've certainly read most of what he's written. I think Hayek would say that, yeah, society can pass laws and say, we deem it to be in the social good, the collective good, to produce wilderness areas and let anybody who wants to come to those areas. But Hayek was also very pragmatic. He would have said, well, okay, is society really going to support this? Okay, we've set them aside. but what about that D- report card that I had the little slide up there on? Well, it looks as though we're not really supporting what we said we wanted to support. We said, provide all this stuff, give us the wilderness areas, give us the trails, give us those dispersed campsites and so on. Oh, wait, and allocate some public money for that? Do you know how important national defense is? I mean, we got a problem. You know, listen to the debates. Don't do that. That is not a good idea to use your time. So I could add to the table up here hats for about any special interest you want, and the question becomes, how do we win if we really think there's some social or political responsibility to supply wilderness? How do we make sure we get the resources allocated? And all I'm saying is, if we pay to play, we get a little more money there, and we get something for it, especially if pay to play means we give the money to the U.S. Forest Service and tell them, this is a trail fee. If you send it to the abyss, to the black hole, well, then all bets are off. And that's what we used to do with Park Service funds. You drove up to the Park Service gate and bought your permit, that went straight to the U.S. Treasury. And then Superintendent Wank had to go back and grovel at the feet of congressmen to get the money back. Well, we changed that. We said, let's keep it in the park where it's collected, or at least 80% of it in the park where it's collected. So even if we don't go full, all the way, privatize it. We don't have to even go franchising. If we just paid a little, we would at least move in the direction, I think, of making that connection between demand and supply. Omega, forget it. But we would get some improvement.
Follow-up question. So,
are you a journalist? You're a journalist. That's a trick they always. That's a trick you need to learn. You know, you just always. I got a follow-up question. Go ahead.
But then, when should ever the federal government make a what's called a value choice? So, for instance, any effort to ban abortion, why don't you say let the market price abortion? And maybe people can argue that. I'm just using one example. I'm sure there's many others, an easy one to jump to. It could be so many other things. It's a matter of just, I call, like, by very definition of market, I'm pro-market, but there's going to be losers. And so how do you catch those losers, and what do you do? So it's always going to involve a social choice.
Your follow-up question started with, how do we get the federal government? Don't talk that way. You're losing sight of what's important here. How do we get the political process? How do we get the political process to do what you want, or to achieve whatever goal it is you're talking about? But think of it through what it really is. It's a political process. There's not some thing called the federal government. It is a collection of people who make decisions based upon the hat that happened to pound on their door today, or personal preferences, but it is a political process. And so I just would say, again, I try not to call these public lands. I think of them as political lands. And I think it gives a clearer picture to me of how they're managed. Now, I'm not saying they're all managed poorly. It's just that if I see it through that lens, then I understand that this is not some public thing that we all got together and felt really good about at the end of the day, and we all walked out singing Kumbaya. No, it was a political process. It generates a result, and maybe you're getting exactly the result you want. A big backlog of trail maintenance and so on. If that's the result you want, stick with this process. It'll give you more of that. I think there are ways to do better. Another question. Oh, Jackson.
So if we did like franchise wilderness or do charter forest or something, we'd have to to maximize profit or whatever. We'd have to count and value the land itself, right? We'd have to have a value for forests and water and air and everything. All those things seem pretty impossible to really get an accurate price for. I mean, how do you price?
Well, yeah. Well, first off, let me just say, with this idea of having a franchise forest or a charter forest, it wouldn't have to be for profit. It could be that you get together, you convince all the people who have land down in the Bitterroot in the stock farm, the big subdivision, if you will, people who have a lot of money, you convince them that you have a noble cause in managing this particular wilderness in a certain way. And your cause is to make sure that you can get poor people from the south side of Chicago to come out here and hike in the wilderness. That could be not for profit. It could be, you know, we're going to subsidize the heck out of this because that's what we want this forest to provide. So it need not be for profit. How do you value it? Well, if you really want to get the market's valuation, you put the franchise up for bid. Who would like to have the franchise on the Bob Marshall? Well, I'll tell you, if I were looking for a new business and they put the franchise for the Bob Marshall up, I'd be thinking about how I could put together some money to get that franchise. The Bob Marshall is an incredibly iconic, important wilderness area that people would pay a lot of money to get into. And I could still let some of you poor folk in. But you could imagine that all of a sudden we'd start to see what the value of that land is. So, but we don't have to go that far. I'm not saying privatize it, only have it for profit. I'm just saying when I pay, I think I get more for my buck.
I was just going to say, like, isn't the whole problem with that system is that not everyone's benevolent and going to take care of the wilderness like it's supposed to be, like, put into the hands of, like, someone trying to make a profit? Aren't we risking a lot?
Well, you know, I don't like going back in PowerPoint slides, but you know, this idea of Bob Nelson's for charter forests or Holly Fretwell's for franchising has to have checks and balances if what we've deemed to be the values we want to save. We're not going to have it be totally void of any human beings, but we don't want people, you know, driving motorbikes out there. And we have to enforce that contract. I mean, McDonald's does that. They issue a franchise. They don't just say, well, you know, do whatever you want, and all of a sudden a bunch of people get E. coli. Ask Chipotle about this. They don't like that when their franchisees don't live up to what was demanded of them. So it's not a case of just saying, don't worry, be happy, we'll franchise it out, or we'll somehow change the incentives and then let whoever gets the incentives do whatever they want. You're going to have some checks and balances. The point is just we could try some experiments with specifying what specifically we want done, and then hold people's feet to the fire. I mean, take you back and think about what the Forest Service was set up to do. Two things. You go back and read the enabling legislation. One, provide a sustainable supply of wood. Gifford Pinchot was worried that we were going to run out of trees. Not something we're particularly worried about today. And supply clean water. Take care of our watersheds. They didn't talk about whether there should be trails for red bandanaed hikers. They didn't talk about whether there should be snowmobile trails. It was for those two purposes. But it's a dynamic world, and our values have changed. I was talking with a reporter from the Missoulian this afternoon, and we were talking about how the Forest Service thought about the resources it had in 1950. I mean, they were basically managing for what Pinchot still wanted, harvesting trees. And yeah, there was some recreation, but it was just a byproduct. It was just like, okay, there's some elk out there, go hunt them. Or take your old beat up Willys Jeep and drive into the backcountry and fish in the lakes. No problem. And nobody worried about whether there was a backlog or whether there was too much erosion or rutted trails from trail bikes. But since 1950, things have changed dramatically. We are wealthier, and we want some different things. And we'll know a lot more about the environment and how these things interact. And so the Forest Service has had to evolve and come up with a new charge. And part of that new charge is saving wilderness lands, maybe even keeping people out of some of them, but certainly managing it differently than it was before. And that's the dynamic part of what has to happen if we try any kinds of experiments. Michelle.
I wanted to ask how you would see the Bob Marshall, if we went as far as your choice of trying to privatize something, how would you think the Bob Marshall would look different?
So suppose suppose I could go all the way, and Friedrich Hayek joined me, and we said, privatize the Bob Marshall. None of this halfway house stuff, none of this, just a little franchise kind of thing, not a few hiking fees. Let's just privatize it. We'll put it on the auction block. In 6 months, there's going to be an auction of, I don't know how many million acres or thousands of acres the Bob Marshall is, pretty big chunk of land. And we just put it out there. No constraints whatever. Just you own it, fee simple. What would happen? Well, it would be a whole lot different place. You would have roads, no doubt. Because what would happen is the people who say, well, you should just, well, you really shouldn't have anybody, but we'll let people in as long as they only hike. We're going to lose in that battle because somebody's going to say, whoa, putting roads in there and a few houses is going to be really valuable. It would change dramatically, no question. Now, what do I think about that? I pull all my libertarian credentials out and put them on the table and I say, the people have spoken. And that's the value.
Because you're not pricing externalities. You say it's going to go to auction. So are you going to price in some type of externality factor? Are you going to look at potential ecosystem services? Because we are interconnected.
No, look, there are these interconnections. And if you auction off the Bob Marshall, and now that piece of land is generating effluent that flows down the Sun River and dumps ultimately into the water supply for Great Falls, that's a problem for Great Falls. And we can, in a libertarian world, we can start asking how would Great Falls deal with the new owners of the Bob Marshall. But I enjoy getting in debates about can we push the world that far, but we don't have to even think that far. And so I used to find myself trapped in these, would you sell Yellowstone? And again, appoint me king, Yellowstone's on the block tomorrow. I don't even like the place myself, but not because I don't like it that I'd put it on the block. I put it on the block because it would probably get treated better. I don't think Yellowstone would end up the way I just described. I think there'd be some more condos built. I think there'd be some more hotels built. I bet you that if you ever been to Old Faithful, it's despicable to me. The people can walk anywhere. It's gravel. The parking lot at Walmart looks as good as most of the land around Old Faithful to me. We could manage that a lot better, and I would guess that a private owner would. But again, we don't have to push it that far. I think we have made a political choice with something like the Bob Marshall to say, no, we're not going to put it on the auction block. We're not going to say, yeah, just build roads if that's what you want. Build condos if that's what you want. We have said politically that we want it left the way it is. Now, but it isn't, 2 points. It's not going to stay the way it is. It keeps changing. And the second point is, if we don't do anything to maintain those trails, we're going to have mud coming down off of those trails into the rivers, and it's going to affect the fish population, and that's going to piss me off because I like to fish. And you maybe don't care because you don't care about fishing. Those kinds of interactions are going to be there to be sure. And again, the bottom line is just how can we get our managers of those precious resources to be A, better funded so they can do a better job, and B, get them to connect better with the people who demand the services. And the people who demand the Bob Marshall are going to be the people who pack in there and backpack in there. And I think if we paid fees, all of a sudden the Forest Service would be much more responsive to what we really have set the Bob Marshall aside for. Again, if you turn these, if you go with me all the way and you want to create private property everywhere, it's going to be a very different world because, as Jackson was suggesting, the costs and benefits are going to change. The values are going to be reflected in different ways. I might go with that, but I'm not here to suggest you need to go that far. Just think about how we can get incentives a little bit different. If we can, I think we can move forward on a path that gives us a lot more of the environment conservation ecosystem services. You name whatever you would like, wilderness that you want to put in that sentence. We'll get more of that, and we'll get it done more effectively if we just bring a certain amount of incentives matter to the table. Again, if it pays, it stays, and that's what sustainability is all about. Thank you very much.